All right, welcome back. Welcome back. So here we are. We're gonna actually get into coding some stuff, which may seem scary. I don't know, maybe not. It's it's confusing at first. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. Something I should say about Unreal Engine is just like it's complex. It's always going to be complex. You're going to spend a lot of like 80% of the time just Googling things that come up. I do too. I've been using Unreal Engine for 4 years now, maybe five, and you don't know everything on your head. You just got to practice, you got to talk to people, and you got to step away from it sometimes. But let's give it a shot. I made a new project. The only difference, I didn't show you the setup because it's essentially the same thing I walked you through in the last video. The only difference is I didn't include starter content. This is still a blank game, 4.6, 4.2.26. Oh god, which one is it? It's the one you're supposed to use for the class, 4.26.2. And I'm on Windows still. It's just a blank project with no starter content. And this is what it looks like when you open it up. I'm actually going to start purely from scratch. I don't want all this stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my content folder. I'm going to right click, new folder, and call it maps. And I am right clicking in my content browser area here while in the folder maps. I'm going to say level. And I'm going to say level, I'm going to call it map underscore level blueprint. And we'll talk about what that is, but that's the subject of this today's tutorial. And hit enter. And I'm going to double click on it. And it asks me if I want to save the selected. Sure, you don't have to. This is like just a generic level that will always pop up. So I will do that. Oh, actually, I don't want to save it. It's going to make me, I thought it was going to be. Okay, cool. So we have a completely blank world. It is just a void, a darkness. Also, just to say, even though you made this map, there is like a default map like that always opens. You can change that if you go to edit. I believe it's project settings. And you can see I didn't realize there's a crypto area. We can ignore all these things. There's things we'll get into later, but maps and modes, here it is. You can see editor startup and game default map, template default. I'm just going to change it to the one I made. Now when I open the project, you don't have to hit save or anything. It'll always open this one so that I'm not like, if you ever like make a level and then you reopen it and you're like, where'd it go? What's this thing? Like, that's what's going on. Let's add some stuff. There's not much to work with here. I'm going to add a cube. Oh my gosh, if I have it highlighted, you can see the outline. Otherwise, there's nothing there. So that's because there's no light. So the next thing, I was in basic and I grabbed my cube, I just dragged it. I'll go to lights and grab a directional light. All right, perfect. And I'm going to move around. You know what I'm actually going to do? I like to do this a lot. You have a 0, world origin in Unreal. What does that mean? That means the center of your level is 0, 0, 0. If you do any basic like 3D math, trigonometry, back in the day, geometry, you look at like the XYZ, 0, 0, 0 is the center. So while I have this cube highlighted, rather than trying to move it, I'm just going to hit 0, tab, 0, and it is dead set in the center of the project. That's great. I'm going to do the same thing with the light. And then I'm going to give the light like 500, 500 on the Z. I don't want it to completely disappear, but I want it kind of out of the way. Again, it doesn't matter what the location is, only the direction, but I want to be able to keep that. And I'm going to turn this into a floor. And I can do that. If you go to the basics, there is a plane. It is entirely flat. Like there's no third dimension that you can kind of extrude. So for here, I'm just going to do, on the X, I'm going to make it 10. And on the Y, I'm going to make it 10. Actually, let's go down a little. This is a pretty basic 5 and 5. And then I'll make it 0.2. And if I actually look, you can see, maybe it's a little hard to tell. There's a thickness to it. This is just a platform. I do this for a lot of projects when I'm like starting off something or an idea. Just make a nice platform in the center with just the basic lighting, and you can start to prototype some things as you're going. So what do I want to talk about today? I want to talk about blueprints. I told you we're going to do some coding, and what we're going to work with today is something called a level blueprint. The thing we're going to talk about after this video is actor blueprints, and they are part and parcel. Again, I said that in the last video, but we're going to start with level blueprints because they're a little bit simpler. They're very, very much more higher level kind of coding. So a blueprint in Unreal Engine is essentially your code and where you write code. You just happen to do it with a node or a graph system. That means boxes with inlets and outlets and like different parameters visible that you can type in. And you follow kind of like plumbing, kind of like audio routing. It is how you do a sequence of a chain of events, like if this, then this, then this, then this, you know. If you ever use Touch Designer, Max MSP, I think Unity has one as well, but it's like not as supported. I think Unreal Engine's like really all in on making sure people have access to blueprints. It's becoming a very popular form of coding. It's considered kind of like an artistic form of coding. I don't know if that's actually, I consider it that. It's like, it's easier for artists to access if you don't come from a computer engineering, software engineering background. But like I said, I don't think one's better or worse than the other. I'm not standing for it necessarily, but I do love it. So a level blueprint in this case is kind of like everything in our level is visible to the blueprint as an individual actor. Every level you make has its own level blueprint, and the way to access it is, actually, just to really quickly say, whenever you see an asterisk next to something, it means that you made changes that need to be saved. So I'll just go ahead and say save all. Cool. The way you access the level blueprint is to go to Blueprints, drop down, and say Open Level Blueprint. And it's going to give you a new window. You can do tabs, much like a Chrome tab or Firefox tab. So I can grab this right here, and I can drag it here. And now I can tab between. And you're going to have so many of these tabs by the end of any project you're working on. And I can use my middle mouse wheel, and you're going to see something that's a lot more like just a two-dimensional kind of canvas environment. There's no three-dimensionality in the blueprint system. It is just a two-dimensional surface in which you're going to be able to move freely about. It's not a text editor. Like, it's not, you can, if I right-click, I can move around it. If I use my middle mouse wheel, I can zoom in and out. If I use my left, I can select things. And there's not much visible here. I want to say that like the core concepts of coding apply to this. Things like you've learned, like variables, for loops, classes we'll talk about in a little bit. Like, it's all here. Functions, I don't use a ton of functions, or even but you can package bits of coding and stuff. I say all that because like this may look like something totally different, but what you've learned from coding will apply here and be helpful for you. So let's deconstruct this a little bit. This is called the event graph. And events are basically Unreal Engine's way of saying, like, go do something, like trigger something happening. And events are always red. You can see there's event begin play and event tick, and there's a white arrow called exec, which is execute. I can drag off of that. I'm just left clicking. And it says place a new node. And if I let go, it gives me a drop down menu. That's jumping ahead a little bit. But what are these two things? Like, there are only two things visible, so like maybe we can we should probably start with that. Event begin play is a trigger, an event that executes when you hit that start button back in your level. It happens once at the beginning of play. So that's something we can kind of work with. The other one, event tick, is it'll execute every single time I think a frame updates. Generally, I don't like to use these. because this is almost like your update kind of like function. I think in there's the draw loop and the update loop in P5. I could be wrong on that, but general conventions stands. This is like your draw loop. I know those are the same things. What am I trying to say? There's the setup. Anyway, I apologize. I haven't used processing or P5 in a long time. This is essentially where you set kind of like your scene variables to start something and set it up. And this is where like every single frame you update something. Generally, this is really processing intensive, so use it sparingly. In some ways, I never use it anymore, but that's a little advanced. But let's just move it down, and we'll start with event begin play. Now, what your level blueprint does is it allows you to create relationships between things in your level, like a kind of if this then that. So let's say that when it begins, I'd like a light to turn on. So let's go back to our level blueprint, or sorry, our map here. And I need some things I want to interact with. I'm going to grab a cube. And I'm going to move it, a hotkey kind of out in the center here. Let's see, I don't have any other things. I just like hate this the same color. So, this is all part of what we're learning. So I'm going to go to content and say new folder, and I'm going to say material. This is not what I was planning to do, but here we are. And I'm going to right click, and I'm going to see something called material here. I'm going to create a new one. I'm going to call it mat underscore green. The mat stands for material. There's naming conventions that make it easier to search for things. I won't explain them all here, but just know that that's usually why I'm choosing these kind of things. And I'm going to double click on here. And this gives us something that's very close to a blueprint. It's its own blueprint in a way. And I'm going to hold down the 3 key and click. And this gives us a vector 3, which is 3 values. And I can hook this up to the base color. And if I double click here, it gives me, I could do this any old which way. So we got green here. And I'm going to hit apply. That's kind of like compile. We haven't talked about that much yet, but save. We'll talk about all this later on. This is like how metallic, how rough it is. You could change all these things. I just kind of built this because what I need is a way to differentiate this. So I can drag my material onto this. Good, now we have a different color. Brilliant. And maybe I'll like rename this to be F2 floor. Just have good organization. This will be my just cube 1. I'm going to lower the directional light intensity to maybe 2. 1. It doesn't see, there's a camera that's working that has its own kind of exposure. And I'm going to go here to lights, and I'm going to grab a point light. And I'm going to move it like kind of nice and maybe right on top. You can see there's a shadow there now. And you can see the intensity right there is like, if I do 20, it's pretty bright. What I want to do is on event begin play, I want that light to turn on when it's already been turned off, so we can see that cube in a new way. So I'm going to set the intensity of this light to 0, actually. And this is just how things are set up like in my editor. I haven't hit play or anything. And what's going to happen is I'm going to click on my point light and go back to my level blueprint. I'm going to close this tab. Just say yes, I'll apply the changes. I'm going to go back to my tab with the level blueprint while my point light's selected. And now that that's selected, if I right click, I can say create a reference to the point light. So now I can bring in a reference to something that exists in my level, and I can access it in the level blueprint. And you can see it even says from persistent level. And what you can do with this kind of thing is when you drag off of something, this is just referencing that actor or that asset, it gives you a context-sensitive menu. Basically, everything you see here is a different parameter having something to do with this object in our level and there's a lot. There's way more than you'll ever need to get to, but it's there. And I want to go to kind of like the basic, and I can even search for stuff. And remember how I lowered the intensity to 0? I want to lower it to, I want to change the intensity back up. So I'm going to type in intensity. You can see rendering components light, set intensity of the light component. There's a lot of other things. They're not what I'm dealing with here. Let's just do with that. Cool. And it's going to register that this specific actor is of a type called light component. And we're going to target that. And then I'm going to drag off of my event begin play and hook it up to the set intensity. And then there's a value down here that's a float. That's the color for floats in here. And I'm going to type in 20. So what's going to happen now is when I hit begin play, a executable like trigger is going to come out of here, travel, and it's going to execute what this is telling it to do. And you can see the Unreal Engine works with a more grabbing mentality. This isn't actively pushing the whole time. Events are the only things that really come forward. Once we trigger this set intensity, it's going to go backwards and grab this as a reference in the moment that it's being asked to be referenced. And it's also going to grab this. So I'm going to hit compile. All compile does, it compiles your code, but like the biggest and most important thing is you don't have an error. If you see this green check mark, everything you built works fine. I think for an example, if I hold Alt and click on this, it does that. I think there's no target now, so if I compile, you can see that I get an error, and it tells me the target must have a connection. I don't know what I'm referencing. If you got rid of that and hit compile, there's no error because we're not asking this to execute. So just to keep that in mind, things won't run correctly if your compile doesn't work. Now if I come back here, I'm looking at it here. I don't have a player start, so it's just going to start me wherever it is. And I'm going to hit play. And you can see that my light turned on. If I hit escape and I disconnected this, Alt, click, compile, nothing would happen. So I know it doesn't seem like much, that is coding. It's coding logic. You know, you're making a reference to something that's stored in your project. You're changing a parameter associated with it. And you're doing this in like a sequence or a chain of events. These are the humble beginnings of what we have. Another thing to say is like while the project's running, I can run back to other tabs, but you'll see that it has this border just to tell you like, hey, heads up, your project's still going. You probably don't want to make changes while you're in this. I actually don't know what happened. Either it saves it or it doesn't. Anyway, just try not to. So that's great. You know, what if I wanted to constantly be changing this intensity? It's a little trickier. You know, you could like, use the event tick, because this is only going to happen once. I do want to show you something that's going to be kind of, I like to kind of organize my things like this a little. Like if everything's just one thing, I can kind of do that. Let's say I wanted the light intensity to rise up at the beginning of the game. I'm going to hold Alt and click on here. There's something called a timeline. I'm right clicking here. I'll type in timeline, add timeline, light intensity, I'll rename it. And I'm going to drag off and I'm going to say play from start. And what the timeline is it gives you a timeline that you can edit that is almost kind of like its own internal timer or clock. Like rather than having to use a update every frame, you can just build kind of a After Effects style timeline or keying kind of system. And the way it works, if I double click on here, it brings up the like graph editor for this timeline. And there's a couple of options. There's tracks, like I can add a float track, I can add a vector track, an event track. Like if you want things to have triggers come out at certain intervals, you could do it this way. But I'm going to add a float track because I want that float to represent the intensity of my light. I'm going to change the length to 3. If you want to resize what this is basically your timeline. I can kind of zoom to fit. Is it fitting? I'm surprised it isn't. I guess if I scroll out and right click, I can kind of pan around. And I'm going to right click here and say add key, time 0, value 0. And I'm going to say add another key in just a random place. And I can do time 3, value 20. And this is where I can fit it. So what we're seeing is that over 3 seconds, I have a float that'll move from 0 to 20. And if I go back out here now, you can see that I've added an intensity float track here, or output. And there's also an execute, an event trigger right here called update. So I'm going to use that, and I'm going to hook up the intensity here to be this intensity here. So every time it's moving along this track in this timeline, it's sending an update, and it's pulling the value that's on that track we made. Even though this event begin play is only happening once, we're triggering this to start. And I'll hit compile. And I go back here, and if I hit play, it was subtle, but you could probably see that the value kind of like started to rise as we hit begin play. And you know what, just to make that really super clear and obvious, I'm going to grab this right here. The first one, I'm going to change the time to 1. So the first second, nothing's going to happen. And then over 2 seconds, it'll rise up. So let's see. So I hit play, nothing, and then boom, it turns on like a light. So you can see that we're building something that's real time. We're actually like changing it in real time how this can all work. What I want to build in next is interactivity. Right now we're kind of like, we don't have a lot to work with. Like this is great. I really like this kind of, you know, light switch kind of thing we almost have going. I just hit Alt to close that up, and I'm going to bring this back, you know. Another thing you can do too is you can right click on a key, and I think you can do auto, and that's nice. I don't fully know it, but it basically lets you just create a kind of a curve, like a sine curve, so it'll be a little smoother. Right now we only have a begin play. Like that's not a lot to work with. Like you hit play and then you're done. There's no like interactivity. What if I were to set it up that when I moved into the sphere of influence of this cube, the lighting turned on? And maybe I can go back to my level and like, I'm gonna set this up a little differently. Like I'm gonna move this guy over here. I'm gonna put the light more like directly in front of it, and maybe I'll even move my directional light, like rotate it. That's a little darker in front of it. Let's like look at this head on. Yeah, we have this kind of dark cube. And I'm gonna set the intensity back to 20. Just and like it's a little blown out, so maybe I'll do 10. Cool, so I'm gonna keep 10 as the reference when I come back here and set the intensity back to the value to 10. What I want to do is when I get close to the cube, I want the light to turn on, and when I get it far away from the cube, I want the light to turn off. So what we need in this case is actually something called a trigger box. So I'm going to go to my place actors and box trigger, and there's different ones, but you know, they're different shapes. And I get this thing that is a little bit of a, if you can see it, there is this kind of outline of a box, and I am going to scale it a little bit. And I'm just eyeballing this, I don't know quite. And I'm going to put it right in front of the cube. And basically what this is this is a trigger volume. I'm hotkeying over to scale. Maybe I can lower it down a little bit. Look at it from the side. That's pretty good. And basically what that means is like we can programmatically set it up that when something enters this trigger volume, we can trigger something to happen. And if something leaves the trigger volume, we can trigger something to happen. So I'm going to highlight my trigger box and go back to my level blueprint. I can close this tab. I could always open it up again by double clicking. And I need to like have kind of an like enter and exit kind of like event that can trigger this in different directions. So if I right click, I can create a reference to the trigger box like I did with the point light. You know, I can have multiple references too. But it's not quite what we want to do. You might think like, oh, could I drag off and say enter? And it's like touch input, I overlap, I get overlapping actors. It's all kind of there, but what we actually want to do, and again, this is like the stuff where it's just hard because you don't quite know how to do this until someone shows you how to do it. I'm going to right click, and you can see that I can say add event for trigger box 1. And it gives me some different options, like game, like I guess if someone destroyed it, you know, it has very game terminology. You could get add on begin cursor over. Like there's a lot of things that more than we'll actually need. Collision seems to be the right one. I can say add on actor begin overlap. Brilliant. And I'm going to do another one. Right click, add on actor end overlap. You can kind of see where this is going, I hope, at this point. And you know, you can kind of fairly surmise that when something overlaps with that trigger box, like enters into it, and this will execute, and you can build some kind of logic from there. And it also gives us things. It gives us the overlapped actor and the other actor. And what this will tell us is, I don't always know the use case of this. The overlapped actor is the trigger box. It's a little redundant, but I guess you could like, you know, if you wanted to point to a specific trigger box and like some coding logic needed that, that's reference. The other actor is what's overlapping with it. You know, like if this were a really dynamic game, if this were multiplayer, or let's say you had a bunch of rocks falling, you know, any of those things could enter into the trigger box. And you might not, maybe you only want the player to be able to turn the light on. So we can build some nice logic from here. And let's just double check this. If I drag off here, actually, I'm not even going to drag off because this is a specific type. I want to print something to the console. I'm just going to right click in an open space and say print string. And the string, as you know from coding, is just kind of text data. Kind of like it's not a float, it's not a number, an integer, it's just string characters. And I am going to drag off my other actor, hook it up, and it's going to convert it, the reference, like get the display name and turn it into a string. And I am going to, I just kind of, sorry, my studio mate just walked in here, but all good. He's heading to Europe and we wish him well. I am going to hit compile, and then I'm going to hit play. And as I back up down here and move towards that cube, I'm waiting for the thing to fade out. You can see that it says default pawn. And if I keep entering and exiting, I'm triggering it. You know, every time I enter it, that begin overlap, it comes in. So we haven't really talked about this, but what I am in a game is a pawn. Like I haven't set up any kind of specific unique pawn, but that is what I am, just because the game basically says like, you didn't set this up, so we're just going to make one for you. But that's good information for us, because now what I can say is I could drag off of this, and I could say equal, and they're going to do, it's not equal as in like I want to assign a variable, but equal as like I want to check as a reference. Are these the same thing? And you can see that it gives me a red thing here, and it says return value Boolean. So I can drag off of, and what this is, a Boolean, if you remember, is true or false. It's going to drag off of here, and I'm going to type in something called branch. And this is where you really get into like data flow, node-based programming logic. It's kind of, you know, what, you know, I want a branching path where if this is true, something should happen, and a branching path where if this is false, something should happen. So I'm going to hit, and so it even says that kind of flow control. And I'm going to hook up when something overlaps. I'm going to trigger that. And it's going to assess whether this Boolean is true or false. And that Boolean is going to be true or false based on, is the other actor that's entering this overlap, equal to something we haven't assigned yet. And I'm going to pull off of this, and I'm going to type in pawn. And there's something that says get player pawn. That's us. That is the game pawn that we have when we're running. The player index is 0. That's just they grab the very first player. This is only, I believe, applicable if you were playing a multiplayer game of some sort. So you don't have to touch that. So just to walk through it again, when something enters the trigger box, get the other actor and trigger this branch and check if the following statement is true or false. And the statement we're looking is the overlapping actor, the other actor equal to the player pawn? If that's true, then let's say play from start. And I don't need a false. I mean, I don't even know how I'd trigger false in the way the game's currently set up because there's nothing else that could overlap. But let's just roll with this. I don't need to hook anything up there. And I'll hit compile. And I'm going to hit play. And you can see that when I entered, the light turned on. But when I exit, nothing happens. And actually what's happening, you can see, is every time I enter it, it's causing it to play from the start. So it's actually kind of broken logic. We don't really want that. So I'm actually going to exit. And I'm realizing my play from start. If I just did play, it would reach the end, and if I hit play again, it'd be like, I already played you. Like this is something that's almost like a track we can have a timeline for. And then, all I need to do is copy paste this same logic down here on actor end overlap, other actor. And if it's true that something is leaving and it's equal to this, I can say reverse. Oop. Hit play, walk in, light turns on, walk out, light turns off. In, out, in, out. And there you have it. This is kind of the basis of all video game programming in the context of our class in Unreal Engine. I mean, in if this then that, like what are these? I think actually this is just a really important way to think about what you're building. Remember when I had dragged off and I got a branch flow control? That's an amazing way to think of what we're building here, is this kind of flow control of decisions that we want to make for things that should happen based on input or based on events. So yeah, that, and like the level blueprint, again, all it is that anything that's in your world outliner is visible in the level blueprint as a reference, and it's dragging off those references in order to create relationships between the things that are in your world. That was a long time to explain a very simple thing, and even that simple thing is probably a bit complex, but I hope you understand a little bit more about just what all this is and how we're even beginning to approach some of these things. Next video, I'm going to talk about what are called actor blueprints. And this is essentially a lot more like a class that you might build. So if we wanted to have repeating structures of things rather than having to build this for each individual thing. And I'll see you there.